Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm very impressed that there are this many people out. I figure it's because you're all checking out the newbie. So as Deb said, I'm going to just describe a little bit of a number of projects. They're all related in that they all relate to disaster resilience. And most of them are community-based or participatory kinds of projects. Some of them have been quite small, and I'll talk a little bit about those where I've been taking opportunities to turn things that weren't really intended as research into research. And just sort of as a bit of a context, I think in the blurb in the Roads to Research description, it talked about a bit of the context. Globally, disasters and the impact of disasters is on the rise, and that's in part a reflection of climate change. Where more extreme weather events are happening, and the impact of disasters is growing even where the number hasn't increased. Some of that is also to do with settlement patterns and the kinds of things that are happening, human-caused things that are happening that increase the impacts of disasters and the number of people who are affected. So globally, there's been an initiative over the last decade or so to focus on, sort of shift a focus from risk, although that's still a large component of what people are focusing on, to focus on resilience. How can we make communities, cities, and smaller communities more resilient to disasters? And there's lots of discussion, or there has been lots of discussion about whether it should be resilient, resistant, all those things. But resilience seems to have dominated in terms of an approach to looking at how we reduce risk and increase the capacity and empower communities to be able to meet the challenges of disasters, recognizing that not all of them can be avoided. Unless we do dramatic things to the climate, which we're not, in terms of addressing climate change, which we don't seem to be doing. But even then, natural disasters will occur. So how do we increase the capacity of communities to meet those challenges, both in anticipating them, so developing mitigation strategies, and then managing the consequences when they happen and recovering. So a lot of my work has been focused on disaster resilience at the community level and thinking through, well, what do we even mean by that? And how do we develop tools and processes that communities can grab a hold of themselves? The large project that I'll talk about is focused in rural, remote, and coastal communities. And one of the issues that they have is they don't have access to the resources that we would have in an urban environment. Disaster management is usually, if at all present, it's usually off the side of someone's desk, the fire chief, the volunteer fire chief often. Or someone like that, or somebody in the community who's kind of taken an interest in it and maybe participating in one of the community, well, here in BC, it changes across the country, but Emergency Social Services is a community-driven volunteer organization that addresses food, clothing, and lodging after a disaster happens. So sometimes somebody who's involved in that will also take a hold of emergency management more globally in their community. But all these communities are having struggles trying to find the resources to do this, and to find the technical expertise, to find the tools that meet their lack of access to technical expertise. So a lot of my work is trying to think through how do we develop things that people can actually use. And there are a lot of frameworks, or a fair number of frameworks out there around community disaster resilience, but very few people are using them. So part of it is like, how do we, I haven't really looked at what the stumbling block is, although we know a lot of it is around what we're all doing most of the time anyway, which is, prioritizing, and the potential for a disaster may be there, but it's not our top priority. And if I probably ask most of you how much energy you put into disaster preparedness and your emergency kits and communication plans with your family, most of you, if you're like most of the citizens in Canada, don't put a lot into it. So we know something about the motivation, but I think also one of the barriers to people actually addressing this is that a lot of the stuff is based on and requires technical expertise. So technical risk assessments and frameworks that require the kind of expertise and knowledge that somebody in some of the communities I'm working with anyway just don't have. So what do we mean by resilience? And the most common description is sort of the ability to bounce back. There's a lot more complexity to it than that, and what we're trying to do now in the projects that I'm involved with, and also more globally, is to expand that understanding and say it can't just be something that we look at as a sort of function of how we respond to disasters. It has to be also how we plan and prepare and mitigate disasters. So sort of a more holistic thing. But I'm going to share some of the comments from the project that I'll describe right now, the large national project, of people living in rural remote communities when we ask them, well, what do you understand resilience to be? What does it look like in your community? So this project, there's a slide later on that gives you all the funders, but this project is funded by CRTI, which is a research arm of the Center for Security Science, Department of National Defense funding. And it's a national project looking at community disaster resilience in rural, remote, and coastal communities and what we can do about it. I wasn't part of the original grant application, so I came in after that was shaped. And one of my first questions when I looked at what was proposed and had been funded was, why are we doing, what is it we're doing and why are we doing it? And it talked about developing a suite of tools, and so a lot of the work has been to try and define what that suite of tools might be and try as much as possible to create tools that are actually useful as opposed to just creating more tools because there's a lot of tools out there. So we went into 8 rural communities in BC as a place to start and asked people in those communities, key informants in those communities, when we say the term resilience, what does that mean to you? Some of them went, I have no idea. So, so then we would unpack it a bit more. So when we talk about being ready for disasters or your capacity, capability in that way, what would that look like? So here's just a few of the quotes that came from some of those communities. Well, first, this didn't come from one of those communities, Charles Darwin. Here's his take on it. It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. Change and a creative response to adversity is a big component of resilience. This is a quote from a colleague who's working on a separate project, but also looking at the same kinds of things, but in small urban communities. So he and his team have done a project in Squamish, and they're now working in North Van District, and they're looking at developing risk assessment and resilience tools, primarily risk assessment in his side, risk assessment planning tools that incorporate things like land use and how we build into the assessment process. Because it's designed for a small urban community, it's participatory, but the kinds of people who are participating might be city engineers and planners and, yes, some community members. But again, they've got more resources in that environment to draw on that have specific technical expertise. So his team came up with this definition, which is the outcome of a process that transforms knowledge about the risk environment. So it shifts the understanding of what risks that community is facing into actionable strategies that reduce vulnerability and increase capability to adapt to uncertain hazard threats over time. So some of the critical pieces of that are over time is a component of resilience, and this focus on reducing vulnerability while also enhancing capability and capacity. So I like this definition. It's a little more interesting and complex than the capacity to bounce back. Now we get to some of the quotes of some of our participants. You need to have people you can call on, and we've always felt that if something went wrong, everyone would come to help to make it right. So now you start getting at that real social, what we're calling the social fabric of resilience, which is you know people, and you have connections and relationships with people, and you draw on that in times of adversity. Well, we have little disasters all the time here. Power outages, big storms, those things happen regularly. And every winter here is something or other that closes the lifeline road for anywhere between hours and days. It's just part of life here, and you just have to be ready for it. So another part of resilience from their perspective is that practicing of it. You know, that the more you face small instances of adversity, the more practiced you are at meeting it. Any true resilience really has to come from the personal level and from people interacting with each other and building community from below rather than formal statements. So again, that sense of the social fabric and building from the ground up, which is a lot of what our approach is really adhering to, which is to say that we want to look at resilience from the ground up and how we support communities building that. Kind of a mutual generosity and a mutual willingness to accept each other, to work for each other, and if you don't have that, then you don't have a resilient community. So again, this sense that you're not only just knowing each other, but you're willing to step in and take soup over when someone's sick, or in the case of a windstorm, So I have the generator, so I'll power up for everybody. We'll have a kitchen in my place because I can do that. And you have food stores and you'll share those. Resilience for me means recognizing the strengths in the community, the experiences that we bring to today that will take us forward. That ongoing understanding that as a community we know that in a disaster sense we have to take care of ourselves. And this again is a strong theme through what they said, which part of what I hear in that is the skills and the knowledge that people bring into their community. And again, that can be the obvious stuff. Okay, so I'm the volunteer fire chief, or I run the local food grocery store. But people everywhere, but certainly in small communities, often end up in these communities from other jobs and other places and bring a whole raft of skills and knowledge that's not necessarily obvious and can be drawn on to build resilience in terms of disasters. This I've included, and I borrowed this from one of my students, was just down in Chile interviewing hospital workers in Concepcion, which is where the heart of that earthquake was last year. Some amazing interviews. Norma Sorensen's her name. And this was a quote from one of the hospital workers that she interviewed. Her work is not focused on resilience per se, but I thought it spoke in some ways to resilience. What worked, apart from my faith in God, so there's a spiritual component for many people to resilience, was comradeship to support the colleagues who were distressed, worrying about their families. So again, that social thing. That helped us as a group to work as a team under the guidance of the one who was in charge. In her interviews, there's a strong theme of being able to act in some way, to help, to be enabled and empowered to change the situation as part of resilience as well. To keep calm in order to be able to act and organize the personnel they are in charge of, sometimes 30 to 40 people. To think during the earthquake, obviously this is specific to that scenario, this is not going to last forever, this is going to end and I have to wait for that to happen. So there's also that sense of time, that recognition that some of resilience is recognizing here's a moment, there's going to be hope, there's hope for change over time, particularly when the situation is bad. So that project is still underway, and I'm going to come back to a couple of the things that we're developing, the tools and processes that we're developing as part of that project. But I'm just going to share a couple of the other projects that have either happened or are sort of wrapping up. I got a grant, or I came here with a grant from CIHR, 2 grants, meeting grants, which are basically to support meeting with people, for a valid reason. So I was working with a Chilean colleague and I decided that, yeah, I'd use it for meeting, but I wanted to do some research and we wanted to do something more than just meet. So what we ended up doing, and the dollars could stretch quite a bit further in Chile, was we ended up doing a workshop with some Chilean participants, and it was a blend. Some people were involved in a small number were involved in the academic environment. And none of those were sort of in disaster management, but in related fields like sociology and psychology. Some of them were involved in emergency management, and some were involved in some of the NGOs like the Red Cross down there that are involved in response. And then the others were survivors from various communities in Chile. We had people there from a community that was impacted by the tsunami, or a tsunami, there's been more than one. People that were impacted by a volcano, which wiped out their whole village and really has destroyed the village. They are now being relocated to another place in Chile, the community is. And those had been involved in a large earthquake. The focus of the workshop was looking at disaster resilience. So, what I sort of talked about is cultural narratives of resilience. I went down and we had a parallel, it's not really a parallel project, but a project in Ecuador that a colleague of mine is working on, and a couple of them came to participate in this and brought with them some students, doctoral students, and also a professor from the university they're working with in Ecuador. And so everything was translated on the spot by one of my colleagues. And we began the workshop looking at, well, what is a disaster? What do we mean by resilience? It's not a word that's used down there at all. So we had to translate that into sort of a related concept. And they talked about it sort of surviving, or surviving well. So we brought people together and we used graphic facilitation, which was the first time that any of these people had been exposed to it. They were quite taken with it as a tool. And the person that I brought down to graphic record and facilitate is fluent in Spanish. She herself is from Argentina. And she, in addition to the workshop and the sort of research workshop, gave a little 3-hour tutorial in-session workshop on graphic facilitation, again, expanding capacity through the work that we were doing, trying to maximize what we were doing rather than, as I say, sort of just meeting. So it was very participatory. We did a number of exercises that kind of explored, your experience with disaster, your personal experience, your understanding of disaster with the participants. And then we did a lot of, while she was graphic recording up front, we had art materials and paper, plasticine, pens, crayons, felts, whatever, at the tables, and encouraged participants to use those either, to doodle as they were thinking or to create responses to the questions. So this was in response to, the sort of statement stub, a disaster is. And people started developing ideas around what disaster meant to them. And very quickly it got into personal experiences. I sort of floated around at the tables and I had someone translating for me as people were talking. And people were all, it's like, oh, when this earthquake happened, or my family was affected in this way. So it was a very personal understanding of what a disaster is. I realize I'm sort of blocking you, sorry. No? We talked about the impacts and these are just some of they were quite amazing actually. They just took to using the art materials in a way that is not my experience in Canada so much, in North America. They loved it. They were very vocal and they used them in very creative ways, painting with plasticine and all kinds of things. So we looked at impacts and how some of those might or might not be the same kinds of impacts that we would experience up here. And talked about lessons learned, because again, the focus was sort of a participatory action, little mini project to say, well, so what can you do from this? One of the most striking things that happened in the workshop, and it changed the direction of the workshop, and we went with it, was because so much of the material was focused on personal stories. This and the next slide show two participants from these disaster-affected communities. And this was the first time that they had told their story to anyone other than their sort of immediate family and friends. Nobody had come and asked them what their experience was, what could we learn from their experience, any of this. And so it was very emotional. Some of the stories were, there were deaths and, this is a fellow from Chaiten where the volcanic eruption happened and talking about the loss of the community, not being told by others that they couldn't get back. So this was the first experience, not only of telling it, but of someone saying, what do you think should happen? What can we learn from you, and how can you sort of direct the experience, not just to us or myself as a Canadian researcher, but to the Chilean academics and the Chilean participants that were there as well, right? This fellow from Aysén, again, large tsunami, and he talked about, having his child swept out of his arms from the water. I mean, this was intensely emotional. It was not the direction we had intended to go, but here it was, and it was like, it needed to happen, and that my Chilean colleague was like insistent, this needs to happen, we need to do this. So we did. And what we did with all these materials, there were some glitches in terms of the getting the materials from Chile, so some of it was a bit limited, but was to do a thematic analysis of some of the work that had been produced, the words that came up, some of the comments that people made, that kind of thing, and develop a report and an article to be on what came out of this process and some of the things that were recommended by them about how to improve the response in Chile, a lot of which was focused on what I call the psychosocial, addressing people's emotional and social needs, not just in a practical way, but in a sense of, this is my story, I need to tell it, and I need it to be listened to and honored. And it was, one of my questions to my Chilean colleagues was, how is it that this is the first time people have done it, me coming from Canada, not touting my own horn, but like, how is this possible? Like, this is an important thing to analyze in terms of the barriers to making this happen. Out of this workshop, there were some connections made, and they developed a group to follow up with some of these communities doing psychosocial. A lot of the students and my colleague also are in psychology, my background as well. So they've formed an initiative to beef up the psychosocial response to disasters. I don't know how that's going, but that was sort of one of the outcomes from the workshop. So here's another opportunity. I was asked to do a presentation at the Emergency Preparedness Conference this past year in Vancouver. It happens every year. And again, it's sort of like, well, I can do one, but I'm not that interested in doing one. So I'd rather do a workshop. And so they said, okay. And I hired, with some of the funds that I have, I hired a graphic facilitator to work with me to do it as a workshop. And this relates back to the first project on resilience in rural remote communities. One of the tools that we're developing, how I've understood this suite of tools that I was presented with is, I'm going to take a hold of it and design what I think might be helpful. So we've designed a planning process, a 5-step planning process that we're calling resilience enhancement planning. And it's really around assessing the environment for resilience and risk and developing an action plan based on that using some tools. One of the tools is the Rural Resilience Index. The Rural Resilience Index was defined ahead, or was a tool that we had to deliver that really wasn't defined. So again, I thought, well, let's figure out what we're actually doing that's useful. So we've designed this, and we are continuing to design this from a ground-up participatory perspective, which the first step was the interview. So what are people saying about resilience? We did a large literature review of community disaster resilience, and community disaster resilience assessment frameworks, and sort of distilled from that the key common themes or indicators of resilience. We looked at the interviews for indicators of resilience, and we have subsequently been doing things like, I thought, well, I'm going to use this conference presentation as a workshop to ask people who come to an emergency workshop like this or a conference like this, many of whom are involved either as volunteers or as emergency managers in some way, what they think the indicators of resilience are. This is the process. So I hired a graphic facilitator to, this is just an example of sort of an agenda that she did. And we used a tool that I brought with me today. I don't know that, well, we won't have time, but I'll tell you about a project that I've got an idea for that I'm hoping maybe some of you will want to participate in. A tool called Visual Explorer. Visual Explorer is kind of, I think of it as a precursor, or not a, I don't know if it was developed in advance of Photo Voice, but I'm using it as a sort of precursor to using Photo Voice. Does everyone know Photo Voice more or less? Yeah. You purchase it, it's a set of 250 or so photographs, stock photographs, chosen for specific, for variety, and some of them are very, I can pass this around in a second. Some of them are very abstract, some of them are very clear and graphic, some are nature, some are urban, some are people, whatever. And so the process that we used was, we couldn't fit it in the room, which was actually a great gift in a way. Because we ended up with 80 people instead of the anticipated 40. So the room was packed. So instead of having the pictures in the room, we laid them outside the room in this like little yellow brick road of photographs. And it was great watching people as they came in kind of looking at it. And people who were not involved in the workshop were looking at it. And similarly, at the end of the workshop, because we had to leave the space for someone else to use it, we brought out the graphic murals into the hallway. And again, people were curious and started talking about resilience and started responding, which is, I think, one of the important pieces that's often missed with graphic recording, which is responding to it and offering their own. And so the graphic recorder was integrating those things into this emerging mural. Lay these out. So the first step in using the Visual Explorer was to ask a question. So what does it mean for a community to be disaster resilient? Go and you're going to look at some photographs, look at all of them, and then choose one that evokes some response to you to that statement, that question around community resilience. It can be literal, it can be abstract, metaphoric, whatever. You may not even know why you've chosen it. The photograph may choose you. Doesn't matter. Pick a photograph. So this is them browsing and choosing. Then in small groups, first in dyads and then at their tables, they talk about the photographs, and similar to Photo Voice, sort of begin by describing the photo, what they see in it, the actual image, and then eventually talking about what it meant to them. And then in their groups, starting to develop themes, which they then started doing on Post-it notes. So And again, looking at indicators. So what does this say about resilience? What are you hearing? And developing, in essence, indicators of resilience from each of those teams. I'll come back to it. I shared this. I mean, this is really showing you the same thing. One of the great things with using graphic recording with some of the graphic recorders is what you can produce for knowledge dissemination at the end. This is Lisa Aurora, and she produces these wonderful visual reports, which you can share with participants, which we've posted it for any participant that wants to have it from the conference website. Funders, all that kind of thing. So if you haven't explored that with graphic recording, I encourage you to, because it's a great output. And she just does it as part of what she does. So in the workshop, as people talked about their photographs, we couldn't do everyone, but a sample of people talked about their photographs. And I would pass the photograph to Lisa. She would stick it up and she would record what they were saying. So you also get this graphic image, again, of this emergent description of resilience, using metaphors and images as the way of exploring it. And some lovely things. This one up here, which is a sort of blurry dartboard. The woman that held it up said, "Oh, to me this looks like hummingbirds." And then she talked about resilience and hummingbirds and the persistence of a hummingbird traveling all this way. And there's also, she was Aboriginal, and she was talking about the spiritual resonance of hummingbirds being messengers from the spirit world and all. So there were these amazing stories, or the tree roots and you know, how resilience is about culture and tradition and what we pass on to our children in terms of knowledge and things. So it was just fabulous, very rich. And some of these other images, again, sort of saying, so I'm getting stuff about indicators, but what are they getting from it other than maybe an interesting experience? So, you know, lessons learned and moving forward, how do you move forward with resilience? One of the things that came out of this process, one of the people that was there was from the BC government, and I'm trying to remember what division he's with, but anyway, he's involved in emergency management, and he's been part of the team responsible for addressing the flooding up in Bella Coola. And they, for the first time, initiated a resilience, this was before this, a resilience center as opposed to just a recovery center. So we were talking about how we might be able to use something like this in a resilience center where a community could use some process like this to start articulating what they saw as priorities in recovery, what capacities and strengths they could build on, where they saw they needed help, and have a visual record of it up in the Resilience Center so that the community could continue to respond to it, and so that, you know, they could continue to sort of shape their own process rather than having it driven by somebody else. Oops. So it's a little scrunched, but this was one of the, you know, the final charts that she did. And again, with these pictures, I've just made them available to the conference so that they can make them available to participants to use in whatever way they want, so that, because really it's a representation of their work. This is the, you know, official slide recognizing my funders for the CRTI project, which you can all acknowledge. Royal Road's up there. So here's the Resilience Index. We've just finished a first draft, and we're now piloting it in Bamfield and Horsefly. And we're asking them throughout the process of this research to continue a continuous process of evaluation of the processes and tools and resources we're supplying. So the Resilience Index is, we've defined 3 large categories, and it's been through many, many iterations, trying to reduce what started as 800 indicators of resilience based on the literature, based on the interviews, based on several other workshop processes. Okay, so people aren't going to measure 800 indicators of resilience. So what can we take from this that seems essential, collapse it in some way, and also develop an index that people can use without necessarily having technical expertise? So we've developed it using Likert scales. A lot of the benefit we're hoping is through the conversations that the process inspires. So it's not just let's do this and we'll rate ourselves and now we have a rating of 5 out of 10. in the process of discussing and deciding, you know, our community is self-sufficient, do you agree with these on a scale of 1 to 4? Do you agree strongly or disagree? Are these relevant to your community? That process is already building resilience in a way because it's increasing the conversation and awareness around it. How they do it, we're leaving a lot, we're working very closely with them, but we're leaving a lot of the decisions around direction of how they do it to them. So in one community, they're doing this process in they've done a special invitation meeting with 10 community members to do a couple of the domains. The domains are social fabric, community resources, and disaster and emergency preparedness. There's about, I think we're at 50 items across those. So they're splitting them up. We're encouraging people to do it in some kind of groups, either independently and then aggregating the scores, or doing it in discussion and consensus. So they're underway with that in Horsefly, and they're about to get underway with it in Bamfield. And then the last thing, wrap up. We'll leave time for questions and show you the Visual Explorer if you're interested. Out of this, again, the 8 communities that we spoke with, we had to narrow down because of the project will do 5 communities across Canada in this more in-depth process. And so I really sort of said, oh, it's such a waste, because one of the communities that we went into was Wells. And we chose not to work with them because, in fact, they saw themselves as quite resilient and had less motivation to actually participate in our process, because it's like, yeah, not, you know, we're kind of already there. So I've gone back to them and said, can we use you as a resilience case study? There's an upcoming meeting in the fall with the Canada's sponsoring it. It's a UN working group on resilience. And they're meeting in Ottawa. They've already done some case study work in Britain and the US. So Canada's doing just a couple of case studies. So I've suggested Wells as an example of a resilient community. They really haven't experienced a disaster per se, but they have experienced social disasters like the closing of, or the threatened closing of their school, and the threatened closing of Barkerville, which is right next door and which is really their economic engine. And they have also done there are 200 people in the community. They have done an amazing amount of work on emergency preparedness. It's quite impressive. They've done assessment, they've got inventories of skills, equipment. They check out their roads each year to see which access, I mean, there's only one real road, but the back roads they check out every year to see not only are they accessible, what kind of vehicle would you need to travel them? Would you need 4-wheel? Could you get by with an RV, whatever? So they're doing an amazing amount of work. So I'm turning this into a little case study using interviews, which I may have, or, yes, thank you. We'll see if this works. This is just a little clip from an interview. If it works, if it doesn't, it's not a big one. But, and we're going to do a video case study and a written case study for this meeting. Yes, thank you.
If you could have those
I don't know.
2 or 3 activists that
Can't really hear it very well, but.
really get this
No, I don't know how to adjust the sound, sorry. Sorry. Basically, this is a volunteer fire chief up in Wells, and he's talking about what he sees as resilience in the community. And one of the things he talked about was these inventories, but he also talked about the importance of having 1 or 2 or 3 key people in the community, activists in the community, and Wells has quite a few of them. It's sort of an unusual community, who will take the lead. And this is true in disaster management. It's probably true in most things, right? Somebody needs to grab a hold of it and push it forward. And they've had examples of that with other issues in their community. So doing that, and then drawing on knowledge and skills and really elaborating what knowledge people bring into the community that you may or may not know about, as I was mentioning earlier. So they're an example of resilience, I would say. So just to wrap up, some future research. I've made a couple of research applications. Don't know if they'll be successful or not, but I want to spend some time looking at children and youth and resilience. Both the projects, separate this one out for a second, but the bottom two, the Children in Disasters and the Youth and Community Disaster Resilience, are designed to use Visual Explorer and Photo Voice to work with children and youth in communities to come to some definitions and understandings of what they mean by resilience, what their experience of disasters are, because in one of them it will be working with kids in communities that have been affected by disasters. And again, really sort of building capacity and how can they be engaged in working in their communities as sort of ambassadors of disaster awareness and preparedness and resilience building. So those two are, keep you posted whether the funding happens. The top one is one that I'm hoping to do. I applied for some PDP funding, as most of us do, and I thought that what I'd like to work with the Visual Explorer and or Photo Voice on campus and do something around the community here. Not necessarily around community resilience, although probably it will speak to that in some way. But how we define this community here and using some of these sort of more creative tools to do it. I think a lot of the conversations, important conversations we're having on campus are difficult ones. And I also wanted to introduce a conversation for myself as much as anything that was really focused on what we value about this place, not from a administration or just from our perspective as members of the community, because this is a version of a community. So that's what I'm doing. This is Visual Explorer. If you want to take a look, I'm going to open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions, and if not, we can also play around with Visual Explorer if you want to take a look at it. That's the whirlwind tour. Ken.
Yeah, I was interested in what you were saying about Chile because, as you know, Chile had this kind of fascist dictatorship since the 1970s. They had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which actually became the model for Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world, especially the South African Commission, which is where my area of research lay. And I was wondering, when they were talking about resilience, after these people had gone through so much, with tens of thousands of people disappearing in Chile as in Argentina, did those sort of political aspects enter into it? Look, we've gone through so much, psychologically, traumatically. Every family must have been just a bit affected by a disappearance in some ways. Did that have some sort of, did you do anything with that in terms of how that affected their resilience to any kind of other disaster?
Given the time frame, it was like a day-and-a-half workshop, we weren't looking at that specifically, but it absolutely came up. And it came up in a number of ways. One, just again, a lot of the conversation was around personal experience. So, and the definition of disaster, there's some definitions that would mostly focus on natural disasters, technological disasters. They included the Pinochet regime as a disaster. So they talked about that and the practicing of resilience. This is why really the word isn't there. It's sort of creeping into their lexicon because it's a North American term that's being tossed around so much and globally tossed around in funding organizations. They talk about survival, and really one of the key things was, and what's our choice, right? I mean, resilience is not really an option. You survive. So it came in that way, and then it came also into conversations around what had happened with the disasters. So the reluctance to the ongoing divides and a lack of trust with official agencies, the whole issue of sort of the indigenous cultures and how much more marginalized they have been and in that process were, and how that plays out. So one of the people from Ecuador is indigenous, and he had quite a interesting presentation and conversation with some of the folks from Chile around that very issue in terms of understanding resilience and looking at it from from a different cultural perspective. So it did come in. It's very much a part. I mean, you can't really not have it there in terms of the culture because it's just so present. And I think in the resilience index, although it's not based so much on the stuff in Chile, again, these political processes where we see the index, where we hope the index will be useful, is not just saying a lot of indices generally and in resilience are created at quite a macro level. And they're used to compare communities or nations and look at funding and that kind of thing, you know, which is important, but it's not what we're doing. We're interested in saying, here's a tool, you can measure, have a sense of where you're at, where your community's at, define things you can do about it, including using this process, kind of official sort of assessment process, systematic assessment process, to advocate for yourselves with the regional districts or with provincial governments or other funders and say, you know, we've done this, we've identified this strategy that needs to happen, and you need to help us do that. And some of that was reflected in what the Chileans were saying as well, is that they need that, they need tools that help them engage politically across some of these divides.
I'd like to actually sort of build on Ken's point, because a number of the small communities that I've been a part of, there's been a history of conflicts among families and among others. In the example that Ken gives, we're talking about trauma, we're talking about the effects of trauma, we're also talking about political oppression, etc. So there's many different items to this. So the question of how do we become or be a resilient community isn't really the question.
No.
It's how do we suspend all of those things that have been in our way for so long, so we can even have the conversation about how to be resilient community. And is there some aspect of looking at that issue or question, even though I know it's complicated and messy and everything else, but is there something within this exercise that enables individuals or communities to actually have that meta conversation at all?
I guess my answer to that is, it depends on what you mean by the exercise. If you mean the research project, not so much. It's funded by the Center for Security Science, and they're not, we're trying to build in some of that ability to use the tools here in Canada anyway, and maybe more broadly, as a mechanism for advocacy and a mechanism for saying, you know, here's our biggest stumbling block. It's not us, it's this. You know, no funding, part of this is a health thing. So our health system, we don't have one. So when we look at our resilience and we assess it from using this tool, the place that we're lowest, the dimension of resilience that we're lowest at is health system. So in that way, it can be used to sort of advocate for that. Will people listen to it? I don't know. In the larger conversation around resilience, I would say this is a missing piece. And I guess in a small way, again, with the constraints of some of the funding and project constraints, because I'm only one of the investigators, I would say that a lot of the work on resilience is not including that larger political context as part of the conversation, in the sense that, you know, we're assessing resilience. We're not saying, well, you know, as you said, we can't even talk about resilience because we need to address this. So I would say that's a missing piece of the conversation globally. Would I like to do something with that? Yes, and I'd love to go back to Chile and actually do some research there, again, more from the ground up, having those kinds of conversations, like what is it that we're talking about, and how do we, you, in collaboration with North-South, address this in more interesting ways than a lot of these. I mean, it wouldn't have been my choice to do an index, for instance. I don't know that we need another indices, but we have a deliverable and it's a contract, so we're delivering what I hope will be the best version of it, the most useful version of it anyway, given that I wouldn't necessarily have developed it in the first place if it had been my choice to design the project. Yeah.
So just carrying on with these questions and similar things that are coming into my mind. When I think about resilience as an ecologist and going back to the early models of ecosystem resilience, and when things fall apart, which they inevitably do, which is your disaster, either things get reorganized and they go back to the status quo and go to the same path, or in fact things can move off into new domains. And the political stuff these two guys are just talking about is, really thinking about, like, after a disaster, is it resilience that leads you back to the status quo, or can disaster be an opportunity for in fact social change, which is not what I'm sure the security
well, it's not.
might be interested in, but
yeah.
in some places it might be you know, new people rise up to take leadership roles
Yeah.
in a disaster. Do they get pushed back down again after they exhibit the resilience and then get back to your place?
My own personal interest in research is around that, which is the emergent creative possibilities in disasters. It's a little hard to talk about because when people are affected by a disaster, you can't go and say, let's look at the possibilities here. It's like, screw you. You know, I just need to figure out how I get a house over my head or I feed my kids or whatever, or mourn the losses that you know. So it has to be, I think we have to tread carefully around that, right? But it is very true. I mean, a lot of the resilience theorizing has been at that socio-ecological place, which is emergent, disasters do have emergent potential. My dissertation research was around that, which was around, so this happens, what's the process? It's not just recovery, which implies going back to, nor is it resilience as it's classically defined, which is bouncing back, often to normal. Now they talk about bouncing back to the new normal. Whether normal is the best place to be, new or old, right? So I'm interested in looking at that. And in my dissertation research, one of the things I looked at place and identity and these processes that were happening as people recreated themselves and their community, which is a very creative possibility. And there were some great examples of initiatives. In Barrier and Lewis Creek, when the mill burned down, decided not to rebuild, a community forest initiative came out of that. They said, you know what, we need to own our resources. And so would that have happened otherwise? Maybe, I don't know, but that was the catalyst. And they created a community forest society. Other people recreated themselves at individual and collective levels in terms of businesses and things that emerged from that. Food movement, a local food movement has come out of that as well, where people said, you know what, we can't count on, and it's not everyone, but some people in the community said, you know, we can't count on other people for this, so we need to make this happen now. So absolutely, and for me, if I could spend my time in terms of my own funding and research, it's exactly in that area. Because I think there are, whether it's political possibilities or local, you know, sort of emergent community designs, there are some examples at the micro level, and there was a community in the States that probably for political and funding reasons, but redesigned itself following a huge flood that really devastated their community into a green community, as a gold standard green community. So they rebuilt back buildings green, they re-greened the environment, they took a bunch of strategies. So there are those possibilities, and I actually think that's where we need to be spending our collective energy in this field, is looking at how we support that. My little attempt with this the CRTI thing is to say, okay, so I'm not really interested in measuring resilience, and I don't know that it's that useful to somebody living in Horsefly or Bamfield or wherever. But if we can give them at least some tools that help them do some of that and say, you know, here we can tell you where the barriers are, and we can go to you, whoever you is, and say, or you know, even within the community, say this is what we can do, this is where we need help. At least it's starting to support that process of saying we can direct ourselves, and part of that can be reinventing ourselves in ways that are possible, I hope. Yeah.
I'm curious to learn more about the resilience assessment tool or the index. I think you've discounted it a little bit. But you've also talked about some of the benefits to the community in terms of the discussions and the learning, and I suppose even as a checklist of things that would be important to work on. What about, from a larger perspective, usefulness as a comparative tool, and also in its design, how do you deal with all of those indicators? If you've got 80 indicators, is there a way to aggregate them and put them in some kind of a more manageable form?
Well, yeah, so we'll start with the last part. We reduced, it's been a very iterative process. So we, as I said, did this work from the literature, what indicators are being commonly used in resilience, and we've worked from the ground up. We resulted in around 800, and reduced those in the ways that we have to get to this place. So each one of those 50 dimensions, so we first of all said, what are the key dimensions that people are focusing on with resilience? And tried to capture those in plain language, because again, you know, it's, trying to think what, you know, I can go back to, our community is tightly knit is not the key phrase that's in most resilience indicators or in the literature, but what is it when people are talking about social capital? Well, nobody in Horsefly is talking about social capital. They are, but they're not using that language. So we tried to relanguage it. And we tried to sort of say, okay, what are these indicators getting at, and group them. So we have aggregated them. We'll find out how successfully, I guess, from the use of it in these communities, but also I'm sending it out to various people that I know internationally that are focused in this area and saying, what do you think? Have we missed things? Is it to try and simplify it? Can it be used as a comparison? I would say yes and no. I think we'll run into critiques that it's not, we made it qualitative, not quantitative, on purpose, because again, nobody in, well, I don't know, there may be people in Banfield that are, doing statistical analysis, but in general, not so much. And we want it to be usable by people in communities. And so much of this stuff is really not very easily quantified. Unless you use a lot of instrumentation, around social fabric. I mean, there are tools that you can do that with, but again, so I think that may make it hard to use comparatively, but what I think it can be used at is, with each of the categories, there'll be a sort of a representation at that level, and then each of the dimensions is ranked. So one could look at that and say, compare this community with that and sort of see where resilience is either at a dimension level or at the category level, domain level. I think we'll find out what others in more official capacities think when we take it into that environment. We have one of our deliverables is a policy forum, so we're going to use that to present these and have the conversation. I had a conversation in another workshop, a project workshop, with somebody from Stats Canada who is also now in the process of developing a resilience index. So we've had conversations, so as you move forward in that, let's keep the conversation alive and see what can happen. There are things that you can traditionally look at in resilience indices that are more at that statistical level, but one of the challenges again is in these small communities, you can't go to, a lot of them, you can't go and find statistical information about your community. You can get regional results, but in a place like the Caribou, the difference between Horsefly and Likely, and they're not that far apart, dramatic in terms of the issues and things they face. So as I say, we sort of adopted the stance that let's make it useful at the ground and then see if it can be used or modified in some way to be used at other sort of policy levels. One of the dangers of the comparative thing then is that somebody else is also saying, well, gee, Wells is resilient, so they don't need funding, and we'll give our funding in this direction. So there's pluses and minuses to that capacity, but we'll see. And anyone that's interested, if you want to take a look at it and sort of give your feedback on it, we're trying to get as much input, 2 minutes, as much input on it to design it in a way that's usable, useful, and reflects expertise in all its manifestations. So the traditional experts, the academic experts, and the practice experts, and the experts in living in rural, remote, and coastal communities. Greg.
There's two assumptions that I make when I look at this. The first assumption is that metaphors are culturally embedded, all metaphors are culturally embedded. And the second one is that the question, or not so much the question, but what the statement, our community is tightly knit, means something.
Mm-hmm.
And what's missing for me, and I know you and I've had this conversation before, is context. How do people understand what that means? Not only in terms of the language that you chose,
right,
or the metaphors you chose, but also in terms of how you are looking to them to respond in a quantitative way.
Well, they're not, I mean, it's semi-quantitative, but yeah. I personally think that the biggest value, as I said earlier, of this may not have any value, but presuming there is some value, the process, the planning process and the use of this tool, and this is how we're presenting it, is about having the conversations. So if I read this and I go, our community's tightly knit, what do we think? If I was sitting there, I'd be going, well, what do we mean tightly knit? So then we have a conversation about what that means. Then we have conversation, well, do we think? Yeah, I would say this, or we've said add in an indicator if you think we haven't got one that means that to you.
So you see this as more of a group exercise rather than individual response?
I think you can do it individually. We are encouraging group because it's in the conversations around resilience and that awareness is built. And you can't assess a community, I mean, your perspective on whatever. Your perspective on Victoria is probably very different from mine. And the more people in the conversation, the more likely you are to capture that diversity from your community in terms of where you think you are and where you need to go. So I see it as a process tool. We have to deliver a tool. So we're in the process of trying to deliver an index, but the way it's framed is around how, so the instructions are best used in a group. There's a number of ways you can do that. You could individually score it, then get together in a group and discuss what you meant and how you arrived at what you may do it in a group. You may take sections of it and do those in various different configurations of groups. But I do think it's a process tool as opposed to sort of a static, here we are. And the planning process in which it's embedded is an ongoing process. So it's like, as planning should be, which is you don't just develop a plan, you then develop an implementation strategy and an evaluation, so it's an ongoing process. But yeah, I don't disagree. And I think as much as the metaphors are culturally mediated, what you hear across a number of cultures, in my experience, is very similar. The expression of the dimension, as just to use an example, as a hummingbird versus as a strong building is different. But when you start digging and asking questions about what people mean, a lot of what they are talking about is the same thing. A heavy emphasis on social capital, social fabric, whatever you want to call it, in all its dimensions. And a heavy emphasis on the actual preparedness stuff. And what we're also trying to do is disaggregate and say, disaster preparedness is part of disaster resilience. It's not all of disaster resilience. So, but yeah, I mean, all feedback welcome. If anyone wants to take a closer look now that we actually have a draft, I'd welcome any ideas. It's really a process ourselves in terms of developing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.